The September issue of Exceptional Parent magazine focuses on the elderly and those who care for them. Sign up for free and read it today at www.epmagazine.com.
Hi, baby. I'm back. You see, I am the replacer. I replace you so you can play Call of Duty Black Ops 6. Really good.
Where's Dad?
I'm your daddy now.
Oh. Hello, Daddy.
I like that.
Mittens is stuck again.
Mittens, you did this to yourself.
Sir, can you please just unlock the doors?
Just give me 5 stars. Now get the hell out of my car. Tacos, anyone? Blessings and gifts for all.
Your Holiness!
Kiss your own baby, lady. Bim, 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 bless. Call of Duty Black Ops is back.
Oscar Mike Radio is a proud podcast partner of Reach Across America Radio, heard every Thursday at 11 a.m. and Sunday at 8 a.m. Eastern. They're also big supporters of the nonprofit I Got Your Six, 2 Lives at Once. And with every wreath you sponsor through Oscar Mike Radio, $5 goes back to this great organization dedicated to making a difference in the lives of veterans, law enforcement, firefighters, and first responders battling PTSD. 2 Lives at Once pairs these brave men and women together with dogs rescued from kill shelters. In this way, 2 lives are saved at the same time by saving each other. Donate now. Go to reachacrossamerica.org/Oscar Mike Radio to help. That's reachacrossamerica.org/Oscar Mike Radio.
Suicide is preventable, and each of us has a role to play in suicide prevention.
Hello and welcome again to Oscar Mike Radio. My name is Travis, Marine Corps veteran and your host. Oscar Mike Radio is part of the Hubazoo Network. You can find out more on hubazoo.com. I want to thank my sponsors, Joyce Asack of Asack Real Estate, Army National Guard veteran Mark Holmes of Reapers Detailing and Power Washing, and my supporters, Case On Shaving Company. Thank you, Travis Arnold, and Faye Simon, Editor-in-Chief of Exceptional Parent Magazine. I love your work. It's 2025, and I've said this all year with Oscar Mike Radio. This year is about relationships, meeting new people and exploring new possibilities and ways of thinking. And I've been doing this for 8 years, but this is a show of first. So for the first time, I've had attorneys on Oscar Mike Radio, but I haven't had a true professor and an attorney on Oscar Mike Radio. And we're talking about nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons law. And I am pleased and honored to have attorney and professor Charles Moxley on Oscar Mike Radio. Sir, thank you so much. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Travis. I'm delighted to be here and to have this discussion with you.
So we're talking about, ladies and gentlemen, nuclear weapons and how the law can apply to nuclear weapons and proliferation. And I'm going to tell you right now, Professor, I thought the concept of mutually assured destruction was the way to go and problem solved. And I operate under that until I started reading your book. Before we get into that and all the good stuff, and I'll tell you right now, ladies and gentlemen, we cannot fit this all in 1 hour. You have a really interesting background in going from your beginning of your professional career into law, and then into, what you did with nuclear law, or nuclear weapons law, if that's the correct term. So kind of just give us a background about who Charles Moxley is, please.
Well, thank you so much, Travis. I went to Fordham College, and I'm of the generation of the Cold War, and we were all very focused on that at the time. Fordham had a wonderful program in Russian area studies because the concern was that our country didn't have people who knew anything much about Russia and the language, the Soviet Union at the time, obviously, and the language. So I studied political science and Russian area studies, and I developed an interest in international law. And I was able to go to Fordham, the Columbia Law School, which was at the time and still is very big in international law. And then I became a practicing lawyer. But as a practicing lawyer, one is able to be active on bar association activities. So I was active in a number of lawyers groups in the international law area. So that's sort of how I got started with my interest in this area.
And that's the thing with law, sir, is it's not just one kind of law. I mean, you've got probate, civil, family law, estate law. So, I mean, across the board, what drew you to the study of international law? Was it just the time and, Dr. Strangelove and trying to love the bomb? Or was it, what, I've got a chance to take what I'm learning here and practicing and make greater change?
What really did it for me, Travis, is I went to work for a federal judge. I had the opportunity to be a law clerk for a judge for a year. And then I went to a major law firm, which had an excellent practice in complex securities litigation, commercial litigation, antitrust. Okay. And what did I see there? I saw how seriously people take the law and the facts. And if you have a civil case, your lawyer is going to be investigating it. Things are going to be looked at in great depth. But I had this other interest in international affairs, international politics, and this was the Cold War. And so there we were, and I began to look at this area of nuclear weapons. And I can't tell you what got me started on it. And I discovered that there is a body of law there, but that the public and even most lawyers and even international lawyers and even military lawyers aren't that familiar with it. And then I saw a contrast, and this is really the answer to your question.
Okay.
While the law is taken so seriously in so many areas, when I got to law concerning nuclear weapons, it seemed that it's kind of underdeveloped. There's areas that need work, that need study, and so that's a long-winded answer to how I got to this area.
So I kind of got this reading your work and going to your website. I'll have the link in the Make Radio show post, nuclearweaponlaw.org, which is like a very clean, concise website. But I'm going through, I'm like, wait a minute. We have devices here on Earth that can scour life from this planet. And it seems like, for lack of a better term, it's the Wild West out there. It's almost like it's like fiction that can't be real, but it is.
Yeah, I think a way of looking at that, and I appreciate what you're saying. And you mentioned mutual assured destruction, MAD, before.
Yeah.
I think a way of looking at it is that there is a body of law, and the United States recognizes it. The United States has, way over 1,000 lawyers in the Judge Advocate Corps. And there is within that a cadre of lawyers interested in nuclear weapons law. And there are people in the Departments of Defense and Department of State who are interested in this area. So there is a body of law, but it's just that we haven't focused on it much. And that's really what my book is about and what I've been working on and teaching for some time.
So I'm glad you brought that up, because I'm reading your book and I'm, watching some interviews you've done and other writings you've done. And I'm like, okay, so if we have this law out here and we're trying not to, like, go to an extinction state. Why isn't the focus on this law when we talk about nuclear deterrence? Because I think anybody can agree that, okay, we should be able to defend ourselves, but this is different. These devices can end lives for hundreds of years, thousands of years. So why isn't the focus so much on the international aspect of this?
I think in the way you framed the question, Travis, you actually put your finger on the answer.
Okay.
I think a big part of it is the policy of deterrence. And I think we, across our population, even among people who are active, in the military and in the foreign service and public affairs, I think there is what I would characterize as a misconception about what deterrence is.
Okay, so because I picked up on that in the book and what you're trying to say, and I've kind of fleshed it out in that way, but I thought deterrence was the answer for years. That's what I learned in school, in college, listen to your local politician, and even in the military. Deterrence is the way to go. But you're framing it differently. So educate me about deterrence, because when I started going down that rabbit hole, I'm like, wait a minute, I've been missing it all along, it seems like.
It is not so much you're missing it. I think the concept of deterrence that we were all taught, I was taught it in high school, even in college, and that even a lot of our elites, who are responsible for our strategic affairs and planning, I think it's misunderstood. I think we like to assume, and I think virtually all of us want to assume and do assume, that deterrence is great because deterrence is the answer. It's kind of a threat. All we have to say is we're strong and we have these weapons. And if you were saying this to another country that might be our war, it might be our enemy in a war, our adversary or potential adversary, we're saying don't do something that is inimical to our vital interests, because we will respond. And as you said, during the Cold War and even now, it's mutual assured destruction. So that sounds great, right?
Yeah, that's the thing. It sounded great to me.
It sounds great, of course. Yeah, we don't have to do anything. All we have to do is make a threat and we're safe and nobody's going to do things that we seriously don't like. And so, I mean, that's, I think, the reason why law is important, because that attitude, I think it's a fallacy. I think it's mistaken and I think it's wrong, but we all believe it. Our policy people believe it. You believe it. I've believed it until I really started. And I'm going to tell you, why I think it's wrong.
Yeah.
And I think it's wrong because it's, it's the premise of that approach. It's almost as if our policy is a bluff, right? We don't plan to do it because, as you said, these things could cause human extinction for, thousands or who knows, millions of years, right? I mean, the science is there, and indeed there was a study which any of your listeners or watchers can find. It was in August of 2022, and there is a wonderful scientist at Rutgers, Alan Robach, who, with numerous other people, that they've projected the effects of nuclear war under various scenarios. And they calculated in that report, and there were about a dozen different scientists on it, that a all-out nuclear war between the US and Russia would cause, get this, 5 billion deaths. 5 billion. I mean, you're essentially talking about human life. I mean, when I read that, I Googled human life and I got a number of 7 or 8 billion, as a projection going some years forward. 5 billion casualties. So the results are existential, but our policy of deterrence is in effect as if it is a bluff, because we know we can't do it, but we're going to say we're going to do it, but we believe in it because it's a way to, it feels comfortable. But here I'm saying, that this is a misconception. So
Okay.
why is it a misconception? It's a misconception because you can't just say it. I mean, we live in an open society. You can't just say something. If it were a bluff, it wouldn't work. We have to buy the weapons that can make this threat of deterrence credible. We have to train our people to be ready to use these weapons. We have to have the public posture of readiness, and we have to be ready. And we have done that to an extreme. We have a readiness which is has been characterized as hair trigger alert. People, argue around the fringes, but we have over 1,500 nuclear weapons ready to go. And if our president, God forbid, should get the notion we're under attack and you have to make a decision, the military tell us, Joint Chiefs of Staff and military war manuals and things like this, the time that you'd have to make the decision might be 10 or 20 minutes because these weapons come in so fast and it takes time and decision. So we've set up a readiness and a policy to do it real quick. We've trained our people, and this is all available in the public literature. Our military in the ICBM, launching areas and in the submarines, which are, everybody's ready. So my point on deterrence is it's not just a threat. It is a readiness that creates a impetus towards use. I mean, I think that's the problem. We're so ready to use them. And indeed, it's even worse than that. You'll remember that we have the so-called triad, which is our nuclear weapons are spread between the land, the ICBMs, which are not buried in underground tunnels. They're vulnerable on the ground. They're non-mobile, right? And then to the submarines. Now, our submarines are great. I mean, they're, according to the published literature, which is what I know. I mean, I don't have but according to the published literature, our submarines are undetectable, right? So they're, they're there should we sustain a strike. And the Air Force, the planes in the air, if we send them up with these weapons, they can maneuver and so forth. But the land-based weapons are sitting ducks. And so if the president and the military advisors and the Joint Chiefs get the word, hey, there's an attack coming in, there is a pressure, and this is part of my point, that the policy of deterrence has set us up with such a readiness and impetus towards use. There'd be a strong instinctive sense, we have all these ICBMs and they're vulnerable. They can be knocked out on this incoming strike, should that happen, unless we launch them before they're knocked out. So you have a strategy which in that regard, as well as by the alertness level regard, which is destabilizing because the other side's going to know, we can come back real quick. So then they have to do something more quickly. And of course, they're as bad as we are or worse because, I mean, we're going to maintain certain standards, one would believe, but plus we have worked a lot on the safety and the accuracy and the like, but it's also destabilizing because we have what we have and a potential enemy has what it has. And anyhow, just to sum it up, I'm sorry, this has gotten long-winded.
No. I'm all in.
But the policy of deterrence is so beguiling, and we all were taught to believe it, and we instinctively believe it. But my thesis is that there are great dangers associated with it because to be as ready as the policy of deterrence requires us to be is to be in a volatile situation which has an impetus towards use in an extreme circumstance. So we've created a situation where, we might do something that on a more thoughtful basis we might not have done.
So this leads me to, the main crux of my questions is, all these conditions are true. You're not, an alarmist. You're not a gadfly. You're not making this up for hyperbole. Like I went and looked, I'm like, oh my God, I mean, these are all valid points and facts, which you're a lawyer, so you deal in facts. So my question now, the next section is, what truly is the role of law, and by extension, international law, to address this issue?
Thank you for, I mean, that's really a way of looking at it. What's the role of law? And let me just step back. I didn't
Okay.
say something. You asked me, how did I get here and how am I where I am in terms of the book I've written now? I was a litigator for years. And I made a transition about 15 years ago to being a full-time arbitrator and mediator, something I had been earlier when I was also a litigator. So I preside, as an arbitrator, one is a privately retained judge to decide cases that might have gone to federal or state court, but parties prefer to have it done through arbitration. And there are commercial cases involving not just tens, but hundreds of millions of dollars and even over $1 billion. We get cases like that. So we have to exercise, as an arbitrator, we are retained to exercise good judgment, to listen to the facts, listen to the lawyer's arguments on the law, and make a judgment. So that is how I've approached the book I've written. And the answers I give you are my effort to make the best judgment I can make on what the questions are and then the answers. And I've been privileged to be able to work with some of our military lawyers, and we could talk about that, and to have an opportunity, to have a dialogue and understand both sides on the issue. So what's the answer to your question on the role of law? It's a complex matter. I mean, I think, Travis, if we were talking about chemical or biological weapons,
yeah,
and you said, what's the role of law? That would be easier. And maybe the comparison is helpful to understand where we are.
Yeah, I was going to say, how is it easier? What is the comparison? That's what's pretty interesting.
Yeah, because we have, there are international treaties. There's a multinational convention to which the United States, which the United States has adopted and signed and ratified, prohibiting chemical and biological weapons. So the law there is very clear. I mean, you don't need me or anybody to come in and make comments or give a legal interpretation, because it's clear. Now, one can say, are these, conventions being complied with, and how safe are we, and how assured are we that our adversaries aren't violating them and subjecting us to a potential attack with these unlawful weapons? And that's another, it's a legitimate discussion, right? Obviously,
right.
But the law, the legal standard is clear because we have a treaty, right? The thing with the nuclear weapons is twofold. But on this latter point, we don't have a convention, a treaty that's signed by the nuclear weapons countries that addresses this subject of the lawfulness of the threat and use of these weapons. We don't have it. There is a treaty that is signed by other countries, not including any of the nuclear weapons countries, which bans nuclear weapons. But, the U.S. hasn't adopted it, nor have any of the others. I think you were going to say something. I'm sorry.
So just kind of for me to understand this, I liken this to the treaty on mine usage.
Yes.
The countries came together and said, hey, we are going to ban the usage of mines because 50 years later, we're still finding them from World War II, so on and so forth. That has not happened as far as like the US, Russia, and other nuclear nations to come to that level of agreement.
Exactly right.
Okay.
Exactly right. On biological and chemical weapons, it has happened. And in fact, on the mines, I mean, as I recall the state of the law there is a treaty, a multinational convention on that. And the U.S. has not ratified it because of concern of some areas where there might be a desire to use them. But it's like a number of situations where we've said, and I think this goes back to the Obama administration, we're in compliance with it, but we haven't signed on to it, right? It's sort of the same thing. There's a comprehensive test ban treaty, which we haven't signed and ratified, but we're complying with it anyhow. So there is a middle ground where there's conventions. But to answer your question, how is nuclear different from biological and chemical weapons? You have to go back to a little bit to a broader question. What are the sources of international law? Where is it written down? How do we find it, right? And in a sense, the easiest source is when you have a convention, right? Because, you can look it up, you can Google, and you can find in about 5 seconds, you can find the Biological Weapons Convention, and in 10 seconds, you can find the countries who signed it, and there you go, So conventions are easy. But there is another body of law. There are several other sources of law, but a major other source of law is so-called customary law. And this is not controversial from me. This is the second primary source of international law, customary law. So one has to define that. And that, what customary law is, international law, is it's international law as practiced by the vast majority, virtually all countries of the world, and principles and rules of international law as practiced by virtually all countries of the world. So you need something to be very broadly established as recognized by nations across the world, and then it's customary law. And so if you want to know what is customary law, how do you find it? Well, you just look for it. You look for where the U.S., because my focus in looking at nuclear weapons law is on the U.S. because, this is where I can have the most access and know the language and have the access, but these principles are the same across the world, and they'd be articulated differently. And there was an International Court of Justice case which makes this point. But insofar as concerns the U.S. statements of customary law, where do we go? And the answer is really easy now in a broad sense, much harder than when I first got into this field. We go to statements of a credible nature by the U.S. government and the military, right? I mean, that's where I go, and I just finished this 1,500-page book, and that's what I draw upon. So it's the military manuals in large measure of the U.S. And the lead one in terms of being the most recent is, and this is something you can pull up, it'll take you 5 seconds, the Law of War Manual by the Department of Defense. And there's a new iteration of it every couple years. And believe it or not, it's like 1,200 pages, and it is very detailed, and it's written by very serious lawyers who, study this stuff at Georgetown and Harvard, and, this is what they do. And there it is. So there are statements of it by the U.S., and that's one of the best examples, and other sources, and it's not controversial, and when I went to write my book and do my analysis, having come from a private litigation practice and, being more a practical guy than a professor, I said, okay, I'm going to take the law as the U.S. has stated the law to be, and then I'm going to take the essentially incontrovertible facts as concerns these weapons, and that's how I'm going to do my analysis. So I've taken the law from the U.S. statements of the law, and then I've taken the facts from what you would take it if somebody said, if you said I'm going to research the facts on these weapons, you'd go to credible sources, right? And you'd be able to distinguish. So in answer to your question, is there law and what's the role of law? It's harder with nuclear because we don't have the convention, but it's not really that hard. The U.S. incontrovertibly has identified rules of international law that are customary law, and we recognize and identify that they're international law, and there you go. I mean, this is the law concerning nuclear weapons, because the U.S. position is there's no specific treaty or law, and again, I'm overgeneralizing a little bit, affecting the lawfulness of nuclear weapons, but the law of armed conflict and the law concerning the use of force that applies to conventional weapons applies to all weapons. It also applies to nuclear weapons. So that is our position as a country, that, LOAC, law of armed conflict, or, it's the same thing, law of war, law of armed conflict, international humanitarian law, jus in bello. These terms are essentially, one could quibble on definitions, but they're essentially synonymous. And so this is the law and it's there. But I'm acknowledging to you that it's harder. If you said to yourself, I want to know the law on nuclear weapons, it's a lot harder than chemical and biological, because, with them, you just go to you find the convention in 5 seconds and whereas for the nuclear, you have to talk to somebody like me or one of my counterparts, in JAG or Department of Defense or something, for statements of what the customary international law is as concerns nuclear weapons.
So let's go back just a little bit here. International law, and I'm a layman, educate me here, but international law to me says that this is a law that all the countries on the earth, or the countries that agreed to it, have agreed to follow and be judged by. But one thing that trips me up about international law, and again, I'm a layman here, I'm not a lawyer, is how do you balance following and agreeing to an international law with the concept of sovereignty of your nation and your right to defend yourself in this conversation, and balance the two out? Because the thing that trips me up is if I'm following international law, am I handcuffing myself from being able to defend myself with every resource possible? Does that make sense, where I'm kind of in my mind trying to understand this?
Of course it does, right? I mean, and this has been a political view. I mean, I think it's fair to say that in our country, which has obviously been polarized for some time, that there are different views on that. And there are people who say, we live in an international world and we need, I'm talking broadly in the first instance.
Right.
A lot of international, we have to have rules of the road. And there are those who say, why do we hamper ourselves? But let's take the easy case first.
Sure.
Right. I mean, I'm just looking around my home office here and I see yours in the background. I mean, I don't know. I mean, probably a third or a half of the stuff we have and the clothes we own and the food we get, it's international, right?
Right.
And probably I have no doubt that some of your viewers and listeners are international and people are picking up on it. There can't be any doubt that in a world like this, we need rules of the road, right? And in fact, just as an example, that's a good part of what I do as an arbitrator. I'm an arbitrator for international as well as domestic cases. So I have international arbitration all the time. I mean, I have a case now involves a securities dispute involving, a company and an issuer in China, and a dispute with people who bought the shares over here because they're listed on the stock exchange. I've had 3 or 4 cases involving China. I have cases involving many different countries of the world. So I don't think it's controversial, if anybody thinks about it, that we need to have law that affects things that are transnational, right? I mean, we have to have it. And we do. I mean, there are international commercial standards. And yes. This is not something I know much about at all, but I'm sure they're international for food and for medicines and drugs and all kinds of products. They have to be safety standards, right? I mean, if we're going to import goods, let's talk about our electronics. I mean, if we're getting electronics from all these countries that we get them from, we don't want them to blow up in our face and all that. So obviously we need international law. I mean, you can call it international law. It can't be domestic law, because if it's just our law and China's law and Japan's law and Germany's law, it's hopeless, right? I mean, if you or I are in business, there's no way we know all that. So there have to be international standards, right? And so there are. And then you come to the military, and actually on this stuff that I talk about as the standards of international law that apply to nuclear weapons, once I make the initial point that the US recognizes that the same rules of law that apply to conventional weapons apply to nuclear weapons, we're into the law of war. And there are earlier antecedents, but from the perspective from a person with a military background like yourself, who've been in the Marine Corps, an area that comes to mind, although, as I said, I'm sure there's earlier ones I'm not thinking about, but during the American Civil War, Abraham Lincoln went to a man by the name of Francis Lieber, and you probably heard the name at some point in your military training when you had to take some legal training. Francis Lieber was asked by President Lincoln to do a code of military conduct in the Civil War for the Union. And that Lieber Code is still something that I cite, and others who do any work in international law involving use of force are going to cite the Lieber Code, Lieber. And so that's just an example. And the U.S. has been a leader in international law. We have the Hague Conventions, we have the Geneva Convention. And you know, I mean, there are those who would say, well, you know, you're talking about constraints, and now we have this terrible situation in the Ukraine, and Russia obviously hasn't cared about restraints on law, and it's bombing civilians and it's bombing cities. And if what we can see in the news is correct, and it seems to be reported, you know, broadly, you know, they're bombing civilians and hospitals, and it's horrible. So you can say, you know, does the law matter? Does any of this law matter? And, you know, that's a whole topic, but the law is there. People have been prosecuted. The Nuremberg trials are a matter of record, and they're quite interesting, and it's all available on the internet. And we had cases, I mean, there were cases brought not only against the high military and civilian leadership. I mean, Hitler committed suicide, right? But there were cases against the high leadership, and there were cases against bankers and financiers and lawyers. Yeah. A lot of the extraneous people were acquitted, but there were some convictions, you know. So there is this body of international law, but I hear you, you know, why should we tie our hands? I have a quote in the book that, and I can't remember who said it, but it was like an authoritative military person who was making a statement. I think I pulled it out of one of the military manuals, or maybe it was a court decision, saying, hey, you know, people say, why do we care or follow this body of international law? And it says, you know, many of our people are alive because many of our soldiers are alive because soldiers who are prisoners of war have to be treated a certain way. And civilians, you know, we're not going to bomb civilians or attack. We're not supposed to attack civilians, although there's a rule of proportionality, and there's some obvious, you know, there's going to be collateral effects, but there's limits on it. So I hear you on not binding ourselves, and we've heard some of our leadership at times say that, but that's more political rhetoric, I think, than thinking that anybody would stand by upon a little bit of discussion, because there are these rules. The U.S., you know, I mean, if you bring somebody in from JAG, you know, who talks about this same stuff that I do, and I'd certainly encourage you to do it, and I can give you names of people who do it, you know, they would say the same thing. They would tell you that we as a country are very committed to this. I mean, that's why the Department of Defense Law of War Manual, I mean, just pull it up. That's why it's 11 or 1,200 pages. I said 1,200 pages. That may be with the index. We purport to take it seriously. Where my critique comes in, and I do have a critique, right? Where my critique
can I read your thesis statement?
Yes.
You have it. The threat and use of nuclear weapons cannot pass scrutiny under the applicable rules of international law as articulated by the United States and under broader requirements of international law not recognized or focused on by the United States. And I've really like grasped and focused on that statement, because it says to me that there's a pathway, a framework out there, but we, the U.S., are choosing not to, apply ourselves to it, and that really interested me, as I understood it.
You've captured a statement that summarizes accurately where I am.
Okay.
The approach I took was, and this was the litigator in me, I'm going to take the statements of the law from the U.S.'s own military manuals. I'm going to take the facts from credible sources, no outlier, no crazies, no, the sky is falling people,
And if I may, sir, because I will tell anybody who's watching or listening to this program, this is not some, guy looking for social media likes or engagement or a gadfly or a rabble rouser. This is all explained in legalese with facts, figures, and a framework that I'm like, okay, you've done your homework and then some. I mean that's being simplistic, but that's the truth. So I just wanted to clarify this is not something you just threw together, sir.
Thank you so much, Travis, and I appreciate that. And it's the way I try to achieve it. So I took the facts from the U.S.'s own statements, the law, and then I took the facts from credible sources, essentially indisputable. And then is where I found the problem. So the thing that I'm adding to the discussion is I think when our military and civilian lawyers go and apply the principles as we have recognized them, acknowledged them, and asserted them in our own military manuals to the essentially indisputable facts, I think we're falling short. So that's where the rubber hits the road in my analysis. I think a lot of it comes from the fact that we've all inherited this, right? I mean,
yes.
I mean, I'm an old guy now. I've been doing this stuff. I grew up during the Cold War, but who of the guys who are actively, in place now in the military, in the civilian leadership? I mean, who's not somebody who learned from the beginning, that deterrence is our approach and we're the good guys and we're not going to use this stuff and it's our thinking and and we can use this stuff. I mean, and you had, we should talk a little, but I'm not going to go into it now. The International Court of Justice case in the mid-90s, where our lawyers showed up from the Department of State and the military. There were 3 of them. One of whom's still around. I spoke to him a couple of weeks ago, and I tried to get him involved. He was the head lawyer for our group for the representing the U.S. Just to step back. So where the issues arise, in my view, is where the U.S. as a country goes to apply these weapons. I think we're falling short. And let me just add one thing to that. That is not a critique directed in any sole sense to the U.S., because as was evident from the ICJ case in the mid-90s, the U.S. was closely aligned with the UK and France in how it, particularly the UK, in how it presented it. And frankly, the way Russia and other countries, other nuclear weapons countries who participated looked at it wasn't that different. So I think people have accepted the nuclear weapons regime, have internalized it. And quite frankly, it's hard for you, Travis, it's hard for me to take a fresh look at something, right? If we think we have a sense of it, if we inherited it, I think our leadership within the legal framework for this stuff inherited something. And what I'm trying to suggest, what I am arguing, is they need to take a fresh look, because I think they're misapplying some of the stuff that they've already acknowledged to be the applicable rules of law.
So again, we can't cover all this in 1 hour, and time is flying by like this, but let's close with this. How do we, and with the law to assist us, and this is the thing I really enjoyed about reading your book as I was going through it, is the law can help us guide these conversations to arrive to a new way of perspective. How do you think that looks?
I think that's the key point.
Okay.
Because I think that deterrence is so beguiling for all of us that even after we're past Ukraine and maybe you've had leadership changes in Russia, but something's happened and we'll have better dialogue again. And we don't have very good dialogue with China, but hopefully we're going to improve that. But I think there's a potential, as there was, as you'll remember from the history, after the Cuban Missile Crisis,
Yep.
when we came so close to the debacle, there were decades of arms control then. So I think when we get leaders who are motivated to engage, we will make progress. We will have better arms control. But I don't think we will ever address these weapons and the risks that they pose until we go to the legal piece, because I think the deterrence thing is too beguiling and we can't get past it. I mean, I'd like to think we could, but I think, and we could, if we could just have a level of communication. And it's ironic, right? It was as if Reagan had it with Gorbachev when they looked at it in Reykjavik and they said, well, maybe we should just get rid of all these things. And but it's hard to get that as long as people are relying on deterrence. So here's why I think law is the answer. It's easy, right? If you're a policy person, if you're a politician, how can you be weak on defense? But if my analysis is valid, and others have to decide that, and if it were to be accepted on a broader level, then the political leadership would not be weak to say, let's go back to Reagan, Gorbachev, and let's recognize that these weapons they're not even weapons because you can't really use them to advantage. So let's have abolition. Very unlikely, but law is the way to do it. Because if you're a military leader, if you talk to your friends who, are still in the military, they'll tell you, hey, we're not going to consider biological and chemical because they're known to be illegal. So if my analysis is right, and if it were accepted, then your same colleagues would say, and we really can't do nuclear either because it's illegal if Professor Moxley is right.
Well, I think it's a very powerful case for the law. And what really interests me in our conversation and how to frame this is we in the military often don't think of the law until you get written up for some infraction, real or imagined, right? But
Yeah.
and outside of the military, you got the old saying, justice is blind, the scales, and that lady is blind for a reason, right? So it's hard for us to understand. And because also, Professor, the law is often seen as punitive at best in a lot of cases. But in this case, the law is a framework to move past this for abolition. And looking at the numbers in your book of who has what in terms of total volume of nuclear weapons, it's hard to make the case that we need to keep this going at the cost and expense, human or otherwise. So I just found it extremely interesting.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate your questions. I think you really pointed me and pointed us towards the real issues here.
Well, look, time flies. And like I said, we just scratched the surface. Like I've got like a whole 2 pages of other questions. Let's end on the fact that the law does have a role, and I'll get with your people and see about part 2. But this certainly is something that a lot of us in the military don't even think about because, well, it's all been taken care of, but it's not been. And a lot of the stuff still running this are back from the 60s and 50s. There's a lot of questions you raise for a very good reason, sir.
Well, thank you. Thank you, sir. I've enjoyed talking with you.
Well, again, this is just one of those conversations where you can't get it all into 1 hour. I don't want to try to. Professor Moxley, thank you for educating me and us about how the role of law can help keep us safe. And I'm looking forward to talking with you again soon, sir.
Thank you. I look forward to it as well.
It's Charles Oscar Mike Radio. I'm going to have all the links to Professor Moxley's work in the Oscar Mike Radio show post. We will see you next time. As we always say, we are mission in flight.
Remember, on it teaches our mission. We care about it and we do it every day. But I think there are things that just hit you and give you a reason to go on. The theme for our 2024 for Reads Across America is Live with Purpose. It just seem to fit in with the vows of the REIT, the 10 attributes that we feel represent our United States military. And I thought, what a great opportunity to put those two things together and show our kids through how we act some of the things that can make their lives better, their communities better, and by doing that, the country better. For me, live with purpose, I think, it's a mindset. Set some guidelines and then go out and purposefully make life different, make a change. It's an opportunity to set an example.
Thank you for listening and watching Oscar Mike Radio, where our active duty service members and veterans are in action and the mission is in flight. Oscar Mike Radio is an oversized load Co-Sinister One production. If you are a veteran or know a veteran who needs help, please dial 988 and press 1 for the Veterans Crisis Line.